Well, it is an honor to be invited here and to have so many people turn up at this auditorium, filling it up. And this is where I grew up. This is my old stomping grounds. So it's fun. Sometimes a little bittersweet, but anyway, it's fun to be back in general at Stanford. And it's also, by the way, where Gödel Escher Bach was not totally written, because I wrote two drafts of it in Oregon when I was a graduate student. But then when I came down here, I spent another 2 years working extremely hard at Pat Suppi's Institute for Mathematical Studies in the Social Sciences in Ventura Hall, which was then moved physically about a quarter of a mile somewhere else, and it still exists. Anyway, so I like to improvise to some extent. Today I have a bunch of notes, which is a little different from how I often do, but I think the notes will help me organize myself. My title was The Nature of Categories and Concepts, and I do want to try to broaden your notion of what these things are. Not that I know what your notion is, but I have a general sense as to how they're used, and I think that they're used in ways that don't represent enough flexibility, and because to me, the action of categorization is at the core of cognition in an interesting way that I hope to convey to you today. I think that cognitive science has been very influenced over the decades, not only cognitive science, but philosophy of mind, linguistics, perhaps psychology, cognitive psychology as well, by ideas that were inherited from mathematical logic, even mathematical logic of the late 19th century. And I think that mathematical logic puts truth and reasoning and such things in the driver's seat or in the first place. And I think that that's very inappropriate for thinking about the nature of thinking. But it leaves, I don't know how to say it exactly, there are residues everywhere throughout cognitive science. You'll find people, for example, using the predicate calculus to represent ideas, and that's one example. People use words that come from mathematical logic, even if those words have somewhat changed in their connotations or in what they mean. So I'm hoping to show you that there are lots of things that you may not have considered to be categories that I think merit that title. I would say, first of all, that categories, as we know from people like Wittgenstein and also Eleanor Roche, are things that do not admit of yes and no membership, exact yes and no answers to questions, is this a member of that category or not? But there are things that can be considered very strong central members, things that can be considered peripheral members, things that can be considered maybe marginally outside a category, and so forth. And I think that's this sense of gradation or graded membership is terribly important. Another thing that I want to get across in the lecture is that I will probably say, I may use a term like member of a category because it's very tempting and so forth, but you have to kind of, take it with a grain of salt. That if I say that, I mean probably a very strong member of a category or something like that, because it's clear that things can be very dubious members of categories as well. Categories often are labeled by words, and I think that everybody is obviously familiar with sort of the most obvious ones that pop to mind, things like book or chair or table. or bird, or something like that. In other words, things that seem to be out there in the world, that seem to be physical objects, and you say, oh, is this thing a member of the category book? And like this, is that a member of the category book? Is this a member of the category book? And so forth. But there are, I would like to say that there are categories that are linguistically named, but that are not just single words. They are phrases, or they are even longer things than phrases, whole sentences, or long, very long phrases, and I will give a number of examples of those. Okay. Another thing that I'm going to say, I'm just giving you a kind of a prelude or a foretaste of what I'm going to jump into in a moment, is that categorization and categories themselves are very intimately related to analogy making. And this is one of my theme songs that, in fact, I gave a lecture here at Stanford in 2006, presidential lecture called Analogy as the Core of Cognition. And what I'm saying today will be very similar to what I said then, but it will have a number of different examples and perhaps some different points of emphasis. So categories usually begin as a sort of a singleton, and I'll give examples of this, and then they blur or spread outwards by a process of analogy making. Sometimes I could refer to it as pluralization, when something that's a singular becomes a plural. And another thing which maybe is more obvious with categorization than it is with analogy making is that it happens all the time, many times per second. When I talk about analogy, I often begin by saying analogy happens many times per second, as opposed to being something that happens, or that is sort of analogies are not just tools for sophisticated reasoners that are reeled out in special circumstances once every week or once every month or something like that, that analogy making is happening many, many times per second. By the way, this phrase, many, many times per second, it's clear that if you ask me how many times, I would not say exactly 10 or exactly 11 times per second. And even if you said in the last second, in just this last second, how many analogies did you make, I would instantly say that's a meaningless question. And it's tied in with a sort of a thesis that I have, that I state humorously, but that I state seriously at the same time, which is you can't count anything. And what do I mean by that? I mean that well-meaning people often ask questions that sound very sensible, but that when you look at them carefully make no or very little sense. I mean, they clearly have an idea in their mind. The idea is not completely vacuous, but trying to attach numbers often doesn't make any sense. People will say to me, for example, how many languages do you speak? And I'm always caught off guard, and a long time ago I came up with a humorous answer. To answer it, I say I'm bilingual, where pi is 3.14, blah, blah, blah. And what I mean by that is, I mean, I don't really, firstly, it would be rather humorous if I'd meant it literally, if I meant, I have a transcendental number, it's an irrational number of languages, and I could tell you the millionth decimal place. Obviously, I don't mean that. I mean, perhaps something like, well, if you were to add them all up, and they all come in different sort of blurry fractions, you might get something around 3. So, various languages that I've studied at different levels, that I've achieved at different times. I've mastery at high at one time, very low at another time. It's all very, very hard to quantify, and it's kind of meaningless. And the question is well meant, but I always kind of don't know how to answer it whatsoever. Because I've always loved languages, and I've studied lots of them. And I studied a language like Tamil, about 50 years ago, and I probably learned about 5 words. How do you count? How do you count that? I mean, how much of a native speaker of Tamil am I at that point? 0.000000001. Something like that. I mean, it's. So how do you add up these fractions? Anyway, it's very meaningless. So another thing is that what is a language? You can't say what a language is, even if you agreed that counting how many of them I speak is blurry. What even counts as a language is extremely blurry. I mean, Dutch, if it weren't for political history, could be considered a dialect of German. That many languages spoken in China wouldn't be called dialects. It's just a historical thing that they're called dialects. And one could go on and on in saying things like that. So it's very important to realize that these questions about categories are extremely graded and blurry. Okay. I'm going to I should talk about some nouns. I did already. That is, a language is an example of a noun that is what one might normally consider a category. And I've already tried to show that that's a very blurry thing. But I'd like to extend the notion of category membership to talk about categories that are attached, that have linguistic labels, but the labels are not nouns. I don't know how many people think of categories in that way, but over the past 20, 30 years, I've certainly come to thinking of categories in that way myself. And so I'd like to evoke some examples for you to suggest. Let's begin with verbs. So I've, in this book, by the way, which has two authors, not one, although you can't count anything. Emmanuel Sonder is my co-author, equal co-author. I just wanted to mention that. It's very important to me that we both be counted there. We give lots of examples of children's use of verbs, very young children's use of verbs, and how they label situations in interesting ways, which are very understandable, but which might sound like mistakes, but which we argue are not really mistakes. So let me take an example. Little girl said, "I undressed the banana." Now, that's a wonderful example of a situation that evokes the word or the verb to undress. It evoked it spontaneously. You know, if she had known the verb peel, perhaps that would have, then you could say that undress is perhaps an accident. Although, of course, once again, you can't count anything, and to say whether she knows or doesn't know the word peel is a very blurry thing in itself. She might have heard it once or twice, or some indeterminate number, around one or two. She might have even used it once or twice. But what does it mean to know a word? I mean, she might know the word undress far better than she knows the word to peel. My point is simply that when there is a label that's very available in her vocabulary and that seems to match the situation in a very reasonable way, I don't think it's reasonable to call it an error. Even if in her vocabulary there is sort of on the fringes another word that might be considered by native speakers, adult native speakers, to be a little bit more appropriate. My son at age 5, his first sentence at school in Italian was, "I want to eat some water." I mean, in English he wouldn't have said that, but he didn't know enough Italian to say bere, he said mangiare. And so, "I want to eat some water." It was, in a certain sense, it was an error. In another sense, he blurted it out very spontaneously, and he may not have even thought about whether he was groping for a word that he didn't know. He probably just blurted it out. Children ask things like, "Do buses eat gas?" My co-author, Emmanuel's daughter, once asked her mother after there was a party in their apartment building upstairs, and they had made a lot of noise, and her mother was very annoyed at the neighbors. Talia woke up and she said, "Are you going to scold the neighbors today?" And it's a blurry sort of fringe usage of scold. And on and on. I have lots of other examples, but I don't want to get too bogged down in examples. My point is that each of these cases of evocation of a verb was, to my mind, showing that the situation which is a very large, say, a party that takes place in the evening involving a bunch of people who live in the same apartment building, who are seen to be doing something that's somewhat annoying to a parent figure, and all of that gets perceived as one situation, and it evokes the word scold. And so it's a member for Talia, it was a member of the category to scold. So I'm only trying to suggest that verbs are the names of categories, and that's not just nouns. They're very hard to define, though. I mean, anybody who has tried to learn a foreign language knows how often, not only with verbs, with all words, but in this case, just talking about verbs, how hard it is to select the right verb for a certain circumstance. My wife, who is Chinese, has the hardest time figuring out what verb to use to apply to movies. And it's interesting because maybe I thought about it, but it really became very apparent that she was struggling. Have you seen this movie? Have you looked at this movie? Have you watched this movie? And I had a hard time figuring out which was the right one. I still do occasionally. I know that I'll come out saying things spontaneously without thinking about them, and I'll choose a native speaker verb. I know you can say, "I've seen that movie." I'm not sure if I would say I've looked at that movie, and I don't think I would. I might say I've watched that movie. Let's watch a movie tonight. I think we could say that. So it shows that the kinds of circumstances that evoke the choice of a particular category are extremely subtle. And of course, in Chinese, when I try to speak Chinese, I have a rough time figuring out what verb to use to say to see, or what verb to use to say to read, or what verb to use to say almost anything, frankly, in Chinese. It's very, very difficult. Let's take the verb to fall. I can give you I wrote down about 7 different verbs that mean to fall in Chinese. I can name them quickly for people who are interested. Luo, jiang, jiao, xia, shuai, die, dao. All of those are different ways of saying to fall. Some of them might apply to leaves falling off of a tree. Some might apply to prices or things in the stock market falling. Some might apply to something falling out off of a surface onto a lower surface. Some might apply to toppling over like a building. Some might apply to a person falling down, and on and on. And learning exactly which of these verbs to use in which circumstance is extremely difficult. So that it seems to me to fall is a very obvious notion. But when I try to say it in Chinese, it's not obvious at all. And it's because the categories that language provides to its speakers are carved up in a very subtle way. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not going to say that there are precise boundaries and you're either right or wrong. That's not what I'm trying to say, but I am trying to say that native speakers will on occasion say, no, you can't say that. Or this would be a good word to use in this situation, or that one would be a good one to use in that situation. I'm not trying to say that the boundaries are precise. I'm just trying to say that they're elusive. The nature of these blurry halos is very subtle. So now let's move on to some other categories. A set of categories that I think is interesting is conjunctions. You might never think of the conjunction as being the name of a category. But in order to get us into the right frame of mind, I'd like to suggest a category or a conjunction that is a fairly recent one. I believe it probably didn't exist 50 years ago or maybe 60 years ago, I don't know. That is the category slash. You say something slash something. So I have a few examples here, some of which, by the way, I just made up today. One of which I heard today when Adam Katzef, who is in this audience, used it. So I quickly copied it down. And I'll begin with that example. He said, how do these compare with your files slash prints? And these images, that is, how do these images compare with your files slash prints? And so I asked him why he said slash, and what did he mean? What does this thing mean? And he thought about it. He said, well, it's kind of like and, but it's a little bit, they're really this, I don't want to separate and say that they're two different things. They're really sort of the same thing. They're one thing. They're combined together. And so I thought, okay, that's possibly part of the answer. I mean, a native speaker doesn't always know why they choose what they say. It comes out spontaneously. Where does it come from? Well, from analogy making. It comes from this situation is like other situations that I've heard people use the word slash in. That's where it comes from. And we don't know how our analogy making facility works unconsciously. So I wrote some others down. I made some up. Say an electron is a wave slash particle. Maybe. Now why is that so funny? Another one. She's a bimbo slash self-marketing genius. Now here's one I really heard. Those I made up, but here's one I heard the other. Here's one I heard the other day. It's just some random conversation. The woman said, "I make a really good avocado dip slash salsa," and so I can read you some others. Downton Abbey is a period piece slash soap opera. He's an athlete slash entrepreneur. All of these maybe, I don't know. I mean, those ones I made up. So I don't know. I mean, I'm a native speaker, but I didn't blurt them out. I was consciously trying to make them up. So I can't claim that these are really good usages. But my point is that if you open your ears, you'll hear slash a lot. I mean, you've already heard it. But I mean, open your ears and send me emails if you hear slash. I may be overwhelmed, but I'd love to get a collection of slash usages because it's interesting. It's a new conjunction, and it defines a certain set of situations, and those situations are recognized by analogy to other situations that native speakers use that have evoked that word in this native speech of native speakers. And it's a very subtle thing. Now, not only new conjunctions, but old conjunctions are the names of categories. So one of my favorites is the word but. And I will say that this is one of those cases where mathematical logic had a bad effect on me. I remember maybe 50 years ago, maybe more, maybe 55, well, not quite, but anyway, 53, 54 years ago, I was a big aficionado of mathematical logic, and I was buying math logic books all the time, trying to learn from them. And, of course, one of the first things you learn is there are things that they call, what do they call them? And or, and logical connectives, I guess is what they call them. And or, and if then, and not. And these are operators in symbolic logic. And so the word and was front and center, and then they had to figure out something to say about the word but. And a couple of the books that I had said, oh, but is a synonym of and. It's just got a little flavor, some kind of a smoky flavor to it. It's sort of like and barbecue flavored and or something. And so I believed that. I fell for that. I thought, okay, but is a synonym of and. It's just kind of this funny quality version of and. And it took me decades to overcome that prejudice because I was so influenced by the idea that all that mattered in language is things like truth and falsity. Later I came to realize that that's not what language is about. And at that point, the word but became extremely interesting to me. And I have a file at home in which I write down, unfortunately I don't have enough examples. Again, I love examples. But I have certain examples in which I see the word and or but used in a way that I think is kind of questionable or interesting. And I write them down. Often I'm writing an email or something like that, and I write and then I look at it as I look back, and I say, oh, that doesn't flow very well. This situation is not an and situation. This is a but situation. This is a member of the category but, not a member of the category and. And what am I referring to? I'm not referring to some object in the world or some action where somebody is moving their arms in some way. I'm referring to a situation in what I would call discourse space, an act of communication, an attempt to communicate ideas from my mind to somebody else's mind. And this attempt often takes place, or usually takes place, but not completely, through language. And so this chain, or this stream of symbols that is coming out of my mouth or my fingers or whatever, it's an event that's taking place in discourse space, and so in this space there are situations, and some situations evoke the word but more appropriately, or more. The word but is more appropriate than the word and in those situations. So I'm going to give you an example. Let's say, here's one that I read in a bio of a speaker who was coming to give a lecture on translation at Indiana University, and he was a translator from Japanese. And that may not seem relevant, but you'll see that I think it is. It was the first sentence in his little bio, and it said, Charles Fox was born in Arizona, but grew up in Texas. And I thought, what is this but? Why but? I mean, it's a dime a dozen to be born in one place and grow up in a different place. I mean, if it had said Charles Fox was born in Arizona but grew up in Japan, I would completely understand the reason that this situation evoked was a member of the but category. But when it was just saying he was born in Arizona, I mean, it would be like saying he was born on Dolores Street and grew up on Murata Avenue. I mean, or something, I don't know what, but born in Minneapolis but grew up in St. Paul. I mean, so what? It's not a but situation. And I think you recognize that. I mean, your laughter indicates it. And I think that we understand that these things are shaded. And I'm not, again, trying to say that some things are exactly members 100% and others are 0. There are grades and shades of membership in the but category and the and category, which is why when I'm writing, I often write the word and then go back and say, this isn't as good a member of the and category as it is of the but category, and I replace the word. These are judgment calls. These are not yes or no truth statements or truth assignments. Here's one that I wrote in an email to somebody. It said, my friend Cyril was supposed to come to my birthday but ducked out at the last moment. I didn't write but, I'm sorry, I wrote and ducked out at the last moment. And then when I went back and reread it, I thought it would be better to say but. And so I was changing the membership of the category that I was assigning this full thought to. Another example, I did these pieces over 40 years ago and I'm still very fond of them. And I changed it to but after a while. and so on. I have many, many examples of this kind of a thing. The only idea that I'm really trying to get across to you is that conjunctions are names of categories too. So let's look at some other conjunctions that are related to but. I have an example that I think you will find amusing. I find it amusing. Light waves are transverse. Nonetheless, sound waves are longitudinal. Does that sound sort of just does not compute? But could you put your, have you ever really tried to figure out what situations are evoked by nonetheless? What is the difference between nonetheless, however, but, whereas, on the other hand, by contrast, nevertheless, and so forth? Have you ever really tried to analyze it? No. Did anyone ever teach you? No. You picked it up by osmosis. So we could go through we could substitute for nonetheless and get some other sentences. Let's try this one. Light waves are transverse. However, sound waves are longitudinal. Maybe. Here's one that I think works just fine, at least to me. Light waves are transverse, but sound waves are longitudinal. Sounds good. Light waves are transverse. That being said, sound waves are longitudinal. Good line, remember it, tell that at the cocktail parties, you'll get a lot of laughs. It is interesting. So, a lot of categories that one acquires or that one encounters in life are very hard to pin down. I will always remember, I'm sorry this is a foreign language example, but I'll relate it to maybe some others in English momentarily. When I was working with Emmanuel on this book, I would go to Paris every summer for a month or so, and I watched his little daughter Talia grow up. And she's now about 11. And I remember when she was about 5, she was very proud new owner of a new word. And this word was par contre. Now, it's actually not one word. It's actually 2 words. It's par contre, par and contre. But for Talia, who had only heard it spoken rapidly, mostly by her brothers and maybe her parents, and of course maybe some other little kids, but little kids her age weren't saying it. I mean, 4-year-olds, 5-year-olds don't go around saying par contre very much. But, maybe she was 6, I don't remember. But the point is that all kids hear words in their environment, and when they're just beginning to pick up the flavor of it, they use it with enthusiasm, with ardor, with pizzazz. I don't know if that's the right word. I don't know if this is a member of the pizzazz category. But let me just say what it means. Par contre means something like on the other hand. So she would say something like, my brother Mika is going to do this, but I, par contre, am going to do something, this other thing. And, but she wouldn't say par contre because she didn't know that there was a final RE in it. Because when you speak quickly, you say, par contre, et moi, par contre, je vais faire, par contre. And it just has this chunk feel to it. It's just this chunk. And she was delightedly using this word. And I really noticed it. It just was in her speech all the time because she was savoring it. And I think you could make an analogy to, for example, an English speaker of English and a kid who's learning English maybe at about age 5 using a word like definitely. Something like that, and using it, peppering their speech with the word definitely. I think you would find it would sound a little bit funny because it would sound like they were trying to be a little sophisticated. And they would be trying to be sophisticated. They would be reaching just a little bit beyond the limits of their understanding, and they would misuse it in the sense of that as adults, they would misuse it. Maybe in their own sense of what it means, it would be dead on. Anyway, but gradually over time, everybody sort of comes to an agreement, more or less, as to what the situations are that properly evoke this word. I remember a long time ago, there were a couple of words in French that I think I used with the same amount of enthusiasm as Talia. If there are native speakers or non-native speakers of French, people who love the French language, you'll know what I'm talking about if I say adding the comma quoi at the end of a sentence. Quoi at the end of a sentence. What the hell does that mean? It's hard to say, but you pick it up by analogy. You sort of sense when it makes sense to put this quoi at the end. If you read Catcher in the Rye, I know that's an old novel, but it's one of mine. And it's one of my favorite novels. I mean, is that a but situation? It's an old novel, but it's one of, why am I saying but? I mean, does it mean that old novels are unlikely to be good novels? You see, this is very tricky. Anyway, you'll see Holden saying, and I don't have any examples here, so I can't quote you any, but he'll say, and all over the place. And what does it mean? I don't know what it means, but I know that it's right. I can hear it. And I don't have any sense as to what it means exactly, but in discourse space, it is really, he puts it in, J.D. Salinger puts it in at the right spots. It really works. And it conveys something, but what it conveys, I don't know. Another phrase in French that I loved acquiring many, many years ago is just an adverb, normalement. Now, you might think that just means normally in English, but it doesn't. It means something different from normally. So I have a few examples here. I don't want to go into French too much because that would throw us off. But, I mean, if you say somebody is going home and you say, normalement il sera à la maison maintenant. It means sort of like, hopefully he's gotten home by now. So normalement in that sense means hopefully. Or normalement, on va courir ce soir à 7 heures. And that means, it sounds like it means normally we're going to run this evening at 7. But you wouldn't say that in English. What it means is something like, unless we change our plans. Or, normalement, on devait passer 2 semaines en Bretagne. That sounds like it means normally we were supposed to spend 2 weeks in Bretagne. But it doesn't mean normally. It means if there hadn't been a hitch. And so when you catch on to this kind of a usage, which no dictionary will tell you, no native speaker will tell you, no course will tell you, nothing will tell you. You catch on to it because you hear it in the speech of people around you, and you hear the circumstances that evoke it and the way it is used. By analogy, you start finding that you yourself are feeling it come to your mind at just the right times. And it feels very exciting. It's a marvelous moment when this phrase that you can't even define its meaning is coming to you automatically, unbidden, magically. And that's a very exciting thing. It's what was happening to Talia with Par contre. She was all excited. I mean, she wasn't aware, perhaps, that she was excited about it, but she was. So these are kinds of examples. Now, I want to say that every word choice is a category and represents analogy making of the sort that I'm making. So you might get skeptical and say, well, what about the most functional words? I mean, I understand that book is a category and that even but what about the? And so I want to argue that the is the name of a category as well. And I wrote up a bunch of sentences today, and I won't spend too much time on them, but just a little bit, because I thought I was trying to show how subtle it is to know when to use the and when not to. And I hope this set of examples at least provokes you. I mean, you may not be totally convinced by what I say here, but I was having some fun with it, and so again, if you want to email me with variations on this theme, that'll be fine. So it has to do with the two phrases, go to school and go to the school. And what circumstances evoke go to school, and what circumstances evoke go to the school in the mind of a native speaker of American English. And I tried to find a bunch of examples and to show how incredibly subtle it is and how it's, again, shaded and graded. I'm not saying there's an exactly right answer in every case. But I think that we would all say it's wrong to say to a kid, you have to go to school, go to the school today. That would, I think, you would say it's wrong if you meant the ordinary meaning, go to school. You have to go to school today. So if a kid says, I have to go to school to pick up my backpack, that's a little different, because that is more the place where the school, where the backpack is, and it's not exactly going to school like to attend classes. But I think it would still be okay. Now, what if I, as the father of a child, were saying something like this? Would I say, I think I would say the, in this case. I have to go to the school to meet with the PTA members. I think I would say the there. What if it were, I were talking to my kid who was going to meet friends after school? I think I would say you have to go to school to meet your friends this afternoon. You have to go to school to meet your friend. I think I could say, of course, you have to go to the school, but I think it wouldn't be as spontaneous. You have to go to school to pick up your gym suit. If I were talking to some other parent, though, I think I would say you have to go to this school to pick up your kids' tickets. If I were talking to my kid, I would say you have to go, I think I would say you have to go to the school to buy the tickets for the musical. And then here are some more. You have to go to the school and then, oh, this one I think everybody would agree that the is needed because you're giving somebody directions. You have to go to the school and then turn left. You wouldn't say you have to go to school and then turn left. So here's another one. Again, blurry. You have to go to the school to get the parking permit? I thought you had to go to the county courthouse. Anyway, my point is not to concentrate on exactly these examples, obviously. My point is that the word the is selected by some subtle set of cognitive actions that are allowing you to understand the degree to which the word is needed in that situation for clear communication. And how its choice would, if you made so to speak, the wrong choice, that is the non-native speaker choice, it might confuse a native speaker. It would be pretty hard for a non-native speaker, especially my wife. Chinese is very, very distant from English. It would be very hard for her to pick up this kind of thing, this kind of subtle usage. But we all pick it up as native speakers when we're rather young. And we polish our mastery of it as we go on through life. So I'm not going to try to convince you any longer about the or articles like and so forth. I mean, I've sort of gotten the idea across. Now, what I'd like to do is to talk also about things that are kind of like interjections. So, for example, there are lots of phrases that come up in, let's say, television, comedy things, or advertising that become sort of memes, and they spread throughout the culture. So one that may not be all that current, but one that I picked up some years ago, and that I think you all know, is hello. You know, and you know what it means, right? It means something like, what are you talking about?